The Coronial Court now stands resumed. Please be seated.
Your Honour, sorry. Before we commence, I wonder if I might just raise an issue of concern. Given the matters that my learned friend Dr Freckleton raised this morning, the association does have some concerns that there are potentially members who will be or may be unrepresented in these proceedings who should be represented, given the way the evidence has been adduced to date. I also note that a member who has been referenced several times throughout the course of the evidence to date remains unrepresented in these proceedings, and I understand from talking to the proposed counsel today that that is a delay in approvals, and it's becoming more apparent that that officer should be represented in these proceedings. And I raised concerns about continuing to take evidence in circumstances where those officers who it seems are now not going to be represented by Dr Freckleton and the officer who was flagged very early as seeking independent counsel are not able to be present and participate in proceedings on behalf of their clients or potential clients while further evidence is being taken.
Ms Oslands, tomorrow we've set aside for legal argument and we're not sitting next week. So I'm hoping that all these matters can be resolved in that time frame. The only other witness that's proposed to, that we're proposing to have evidence from today is, I think it's Senior Sergeant, is that correct?
Senior Sergeant, yes.
Senior Sergeant Finesse. I do not envisage that his evidence is going to be extensive or likely controversial. And in my view, given the need to progress these matters, I would be minded to take his evidence today. If other issues arise and parties wish to object to certain parts of his evidence, that can be dealt with, and we can always, if I ruled that certain parts were not admissible, I wouldn't take them into account and the transcript can be redacted, and ultimately, if necessary, we could recall Senior Sergeant Finesse if anyone wanted to conduct any further cross-examination. But given the need to press on, I think if there were any issues that they can be remedied fairly to ensure that the matter can proceed, particularly in light of the fact that there's only one other witness proposed and then several days for these matters to be sorted out.
My two possibilities, if I may, in relation to that matter. Explain from what took place before lunch that Dr Freckleton is in a position of conflict, and in my submission that necessarily arose or became obvious and extreme as a result of the cross-examination or examination of Superintendent Knowles yesterday, that is deploying him in connection with him expressing opinions of the like about various members of the IRT.
Oh, well, I would have thought that was always on the cards, that he would be, as the office superintendent, involved in deploying those members, his views as to what they were deployed for and whether or not they enact or behaved in a manner consistent with that deployment was always a matter for
if I could just continue, Your Honour, on based on the question of conflict. The issue of conflict has now arisen regardless. Secondly, the issues that were ventilated none of us were on notice about at all. They don't exist in any of the statements, they don't exist in the transcript at trial, they don't exist in committee. and there was no forewarning of it. And so the consequence of that is that the conflict has arisen such that members of the IRT team are now exposed in a way that is obvious and palpable. As I understand it, Dr. Freckleton also represents the next witness. Now, whilst it's true, as Your Honour says, and certainly to my knowledge, his evidence should be completely uncontroversial and really concise, and I doubt I'll have a question for it. But if it is proposed that counsel assisting, whoever might be leading this witness, is going to go down a similar path as what went on yesterday, then plainly that can't happen.
It's not anything about what went on yesterday. The inquest is being conducted in an appropriate manner to inquire into the issues that clearly are arising on the material in the brief.
Your Honour, I've put my position. I simply say that there is a conflict which has now been identified. As long as that conflict exists, it should be resolved in my submission before we go any further. That is the position I put.
Can I just raise 2 points, Your Honour? As to the notion that there was no forewarning, we are all adults, we are legal professionals, the brief was served. In my respectful submission, it would be apparent to any competent lawyer reading that brief that the individual who was instrumental in developing the plan might have opinions about how the plan was executed. He authorised it, Your Honour. The second point is I have absolutely no intention to do any more than briefly, and when I say briefly I mean in about 10 or 15 minutes, cover off Senior Sergeant Finis's very limited role in relaying information between 2 other police officers. I'm not sure whether Mr Edwardson was saying that he presses an objection to continuing if that is the limited scope of the evidence, but in that case I think that we're all agreed we can continue.
I accept it.
So I've proposed a mechanism to address if people become represented and there are any issues that arise that we don't anticipate at the moment, but if they do arise, for addressing that, either by recall or objection. Does anyone wish to say anything about that proposed mechanism to address any concerns if, in the unlikely event, they might arise? Then Ms Oslands and Mr Edwardson, I am proposing to proceed with this witness and if any issues arise, to deal with it in the way that I've indicated.
Thank you, Your Honour. Can I just indicate I'm not instructed by any of those officers. I simply raised the concern to ensure that convenience doesn't overtake fairness being afforded to those who are not represented here.
Sorry.
Your Honour, just one final point, and it's this. If the point that Ms Oswald raised in open court with the witness sitting in the box had been conveyed to the counsel assisting team, we might have had a mature conversation about it and could have allayed any of the concerns that have been allayed in open court with something like 24 legal representatives standing around the table. So we would just ask that if concerns like this arise, we have conversations about them rather than duking it out in court.
Sure. We'll progress as efficiently as we can, taking into account, obviously, the need to be fair and to accord procedural fairness. And I believe that the way that I have suggested that we proceed with this witness meets both those requirements, and we'll proceed.
Thank you. I call Senior Sergeant Sean Furniss, Your Honour.
Senior Sergeant, do you promise to tell the truth to the court?
I do.
And I think maybe you were brought forward, so I appreciate you coming at short notice.
Thank you, Your Honour. That's fine.
Senior Sergeant, could I ask you to repeat your name, rank and station?
Yeah, Sean Rodney Furniss is a middle name. I'm a Senior Sergeant of Police of the Northern Territory, and I'm currently based at the Alice Springs Police Station in charge as the Senior Sergeant in charge of the Southern Desert Division.
And on the 30th of November 2019, you gave a recorded statutory declaration.
That is correct, yes.
Your Honour, that's item 7-41. I want to just quickly ask you about your career as a police officer. I won't do it in great detail, but you became a police officer in round about 1988.
That's correct, Your Honour.
Where were you stationed at that time?
From the training college, obviously in Darwin, I was deployed straight down to Alice Springs. That was December of 1988.
And I think you were there until about 1991.
That's correct, Your Honour.
And between 1991 and roughly 1999, you served in remote police stations.
That is correct, yes, Your Honour.
And they included Hermansburg,
Correct.
Haas Range,
Harts Range, yes, correct.
and just for the purpose of clarity, Haas Range is a community towards the Queensland border. It's
That's
not
correct.
Haas.
It's on Pass Bluff's on the western side of the Stuart Highway, and on the eastern side of the Stuart Highway is where Harts Range is.
And is it a different spelling?
It's got a couple of spellings. It's Harts spelt with a Z on the end of it, or an S. Harts Range, Range, of course, and Haas Bluff is different.
Yes.
You were then in Tea Tree,
That's correct.
and from 1999 you ended up in Darwin,
Correct.
where you remained until 2017.
That is correct, yes.
And in 2017 you returned to Alice Springs.
That is correct also, yes.
In November of 2019, you were still a Senior Sergeant of Police, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Where were you stationed at that time?
At that stage, I was, in 2017, I'd taken up position as a watch commander in Alice Springs.
We've heard the expression watch commander on a couple of occasions in these proceedings. Can you give Her Honour a pretty general idea of the role that a watch commander plays?
Yes, Your Honour.
Station like Alice?
Yeah, oh, sorry.
Are
Yeah.
they all senior sergeants?
They are. That's the rank level. It's the highest ranking or non-commissioned officer on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there are two watch commanders, one for the northern region, which I'd previously undertaken since, I think it was in 2013. And then there's one for the southern region, which I moved back down to in 2017 and took up that role. So it's the highest ranking non-commissioned officer on duty 24/7 is basically.
And within a police station like Alice Springs, what's the next level of command directly underneath you?
Will be a sergeant under myself. There's several sergeant positions as such. Two directly in Alice Springs is the shift supervisor sergeant, and then there's a custody sergeant, and then you also got a sergeant in Tennant Creek, which we also also look after Tennant Creek.
The shift supervisor, also known as a patrol sergeant,
That would be correct, yes. Yeah.
and they effectively supervise at the most day-to-day level a patrol group of constables, senior constables and the like.
The patrol supervisor, that's correct, yes. Yeah.
What level of involvement, if any, does a watch commander have on a day-to-day basis in the supervision of individual members of a patrol group?
So sort of an overall supervision. You sort of got the bigger picture because you're also looking after. You're also directed around the custody area, also the other stations around the post. So day-to-day basis, certainly not as a high level of supervision of individual officers as what the shift supervisor would be doing.
Okay. I want to come to some specific evidence about 9 November 2019 in a moment. But before I do that, I just want to pick up on something that you noted in your recorded statutory declaration. This is at page 22 for the record. You were asked some questions about staffing levels in November of 2019, and you said words to the effect of that you were struggling to meet staffing requirements on a lot of occasions at around about that time. What did that mean?
It means meeting demand, basically. But put it very, very generally, meeting demand. I mean, obviously there's demands on policing services, and to meet that, to provide an effective and overall level of service to the community, we need a certain level of policing. And on occasions there it was becoming difficult to meet that demand. I mean, that's not a generalised. Well, I suppose it is a generalisation, but just meeting the demand on a day-to-day basis of what was required of our officers.
And when you talk about demand, you're talking about demand at
from clients, but basically from calls to dispatch to matters, priority levels, and getting there in a timely fashion, getting to the right place at the right time.
In your view at that time, was the difficulty recruiting the junior level constables, or was the difficulty elsewhere?
We were very junior workforce, I suppose, in Alice Springs, comparably to where I've worked previously. We were having, I suppose, we were getting our fair share of the recruits coming out of training, but as for the next levels up, where your more experienced constables were sort of probably say not at a level what I'd call ideal in that aspect.
And when you're talking about next level up, you're talking about constable first class and up.
Yeah, well, the people that have been round in the policing environment for a number of years, so your first class constables and your senior constables in that aspect, in that area.
Now, you said you were talking about, I think, a comparison between places you'd worked previously. How did the seniority of the Alice Springs station in November 2019, from about 2017, how did it compare to Darwin when you'd left it?
Oh, certainly there were a lot more senior people up there. I mean, I worked around different areas in the Darwin area. Obviously, the last workplace was a watch commander as well. We were sort of separated from a lot of the other stations, but certainly there were a greater percentage of senior constables and first class constables in the general duties area there than what there were down here at Don, which I found. When I arrived here, it was very obvious that it was very junior. Yes.
And what about compared to your early days in 1988, the 3 years or so you spent in Alice Springs?
Yeah, if I can go back to that, my memory is very, very vague, but I certainly know for at least the first 6 months, my senior partner was a senior constable, certainly nothing less than a constable first class.
And in November of 2019, would that have been less common for a junior partner in a patrol group to almost always be partnered with a senior constable?
Yes, that was not a regular thing.
Is it fair to say that in November of 2019, Alice Springs had more or less lost that senior constable level?
I mean, still certainly senior constables in Alice Springs. A lot of those were acting in higher positions as well, but certainly it hadn't. It certainly. I mean, policing evolved over 30 or 25 to 30 years, I suppose. Certainly, policing had evolved over there. So it was noticeable to me that you come back to a place where you've been before, and it was the levels of certainly junior down here compared to what it used to be.
As the junior partner, let's say you're called out to a general duties issue with a partner. As the junior member of that partnership, how significant is the senior constable or the senior partner?
Well, certainly with, I mean, people that have been policing for a time have a range of experiences in similar but different situations. Every situation you go to has got its own dynamics, I suppose. So you can't beat the actual on-the-job experience as a part. Well, you can't really compare it to learning in a classroom environment to actually being out there. So people that are involved in situations before will have a better idea of how that situation may evolve. If you do something, then that will occur. If you do this, that will occur on probability. So you do get a range of. If as a junior partner, you'd get a range of sort of experiences of other situations from your senior partner.
I want to skip forward to the 9th of November. Before I ask you about specifics, can I just ask you for a very general understanding of what role you understood you to have played in the decision-making surrounding the deployment of the IRT?
On that particular day, very, very limited around the decision-making area. I had, I had a call from the superintendent to ask what a IRT deployment would look like in an administrative sense, as opposed to an operational sort of area. It was more the how would we go getting people in, and that was the basically the question that I answered or assisted with.
And you were managing the roster not just for the purpose of the deployment of the IRT, you were managing it across the Alice Springs police station.
That's correct. Well, it was on the weekend, so you don't have your normal officer in charge of the police station there, or your administration staff as well. So my obviously, if that was going to happen, I would, from my, I wouldn't say selfish, but from my aspect, is that I wouldn't like to choose people that were due to come on the next shift. That would obviously mean further replacement of those people on that shift. So that was sort of the parameters of what I saw, and that was my sort of boundary as such. I would rather not choose people that were coming on, because it would be difficult to replace them to provide the ongoing operational policing services that were required during that shift.
I'm going to ask you some question about communication, what was said to you, what you said to others. But in terms of actual decision making, is it your evidence that your input was really limited to managing the roster in Alice Springs?
Well, that was what was posed to me. I wasn't asked to do anything further than that. It was just that
to you?
Superintendent Nobbs when he had called me originally. Yes.
Now, did you take any notes of the conversations you had with Superintendent Nobbs and others from about 1:30 p.m. on the 9th of November?
No, unfortunately, I didn't take notes as such. All my so as it was ongoing, my involvement I thought was quite limited, and it was just putting people in contact with, basically getting a response, sort of getting members in.
Had you been making operational or tactical decisions, would you have taken notes?
Yeah, that's correct. What my note taking was in the watch commander's position. I'll just sort of, I suppose I'll elaborate on that a little bit. As another incident which took place shortly thereafter, a lot of my note taking in regard to an operational incident is recorded on our ICAD system, which is attached to an incident as such, I suppose. This was not being reported through for me to organise. It was the phone call was for me to make contact and have people called in, and that's sort of where I took my involvement on that particular thing at that stage. Yeah.
I want to ask you some questions about the quality of your memory today, but before I ask that question, because it might be relevant to it.
Yes, sir.
Did anything happen later in the day that affected the extent to which you were involved in the deployment of the IRT?
Yes, there was what would you call a major incident where a tourist bus had collided with another car and rolled over on a remote road, possibly somewhere, I think it was about 120 to 140 kilometres sort of from Alice Springs. And communication, we were advised, or police were advised by a 000 call that come from a location due to there's no mobile phone coverage there at all. So that was where my attention was and priorities were then drawn. Whilst this was still, obviously the situation was still going ahead in regard to the call out.
If I put it to you that you received a telephone call from Superintendent Nobbs and then a text message from Pauline Vickery at approximately 2:40 p.m. in the afternoon about the bus rollover, would that sound about right?
That sound about right. I know in my conversations with Superintendent Nobbs, I advised him of the bus incident, and he said, "Well, look, you run with that. You do whatever you need to do with that." At that stage, I wasn't 100% aware of whose district that actually occurred in. As my next sort of thing would be to speak to the divisional superintendent. Where it turned out, it was sort of on the border of Alice Springs and Southern Desert, or Central Desert, I think it was called then. Anyway, so that's it, and I've just basically facilitated that, making sure that communication had got through, so people that needed to know knew.
When you say that communication, are you talking about communication regarding the IRT deployment or the bus rollover?
The bus thing at that stage as well. I mean, obviously this was in amongst a couple of phone calls with the superintendent, obviously in regard to the IRT thing when I've spoken to Sergeant McCormack. So I'm not sure if we're getting track here or not.
Now, I want to ask you these questions now about your memory. In your recorded statement, you provide information about a series of telephone calls you had.
Yes.
Over a period of about 2 hours, and one or more conversations that you had with Acting Sergeant Shane McCormack. Do you agree?
Correct, yes, I do agree. Yeah.
What is your ability now to recall specifically what was said during those telephone calls? So those telephone calls and conversations in person?
Yeah. My ability to recall that is very limited.
And in terms of being able to distinguish what was said, for example, in the first conversation you had with Nobs versus what was said while you were present in a room with McCormack and had Nobs on the speakerphone, would you be able to accurately say what was said when?
No, and I think I even said when I provided my statement, I was unsure of certain things that even at that stage that I hadn't retained in my mind.
Bearing that in mind, I do want to ask you some more specific questions, if I can, Senior Sergeant. If I put it to you that the first conversation that you had with Superintendent Nobs occurred at somewhere around 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon, would that sound about right?
That would be about right, yes, correct.
And do you recall where you were?
That stage I was sitting in what was the Watch Commander's office in the Alice Springs Police Station. I remember that because that's where I answered the phone from. And
as best you can recall, what did Superintendent Nobs say to you?
He wanted to ask me what it would look like for a IRT recall or call out to go to Yuendamu.
When you say what it would look like,
as in administratively, I think that's what was raised before in regard to what would it look like for the rostering purposes.
Did Superintendent Nobs tell you anything about what?
He did.
Why he was asking?
He did mention why he was asking. Yes.
And what did he say?
Said that there's been issues at Yuendamu. It's possible that, and again, the sequence of the actual chronology of what was said was there. There looks like the health staff may be pulling out of there, and I'm not sure. Again, I couldn't remember at the time whether he said that had occurred or whether it was going to occur. And there's been issues in the community, and I suspect that there was a person that may be involved.
What do you mean by issues in the community?
Issues with crime, property crime in the community. That's what it was led to believe. That was.
Did you understand there to be a relationship between those issues, property crime, and the health decision making, or were they separate?
That's sort of what was raised to me. That's sort of what I took from that conversation.
And you also said an individual who might or might not be involved in those issues. Who was that?
I seem to think that would be Kumanjayi.
Okay. Now, what did you understand the IRT? Sorry, did Superintendent Nobs tell you anything about what the IRT were to do once they were in Yuendamu?
Was assisting the members out there.
Okay. What were they to assist them to do?
To assist them with policing out there and to assist in the arrest of Kumanjayi.
Okay. In your recorded statement at page 3, you say that during the conversation, Nobs told me the story in regard to the apprehension of Walker. Can you recall what that story was?
No, I can't. Suppose so. The story. Sorry,
Please don't guess. If you're not.
I'm not going to guess the story of that, but maybe you might be able to enlighten me a little bit further in regard to.
Asking the question because I was genuinely interested. So, yeah.
Thanks, John.
Now, did he tell you anything about the specific plan for the arrest of Kumanjayi?
It was proposed that was early the next morning that they would go and arrest him, and that was the plan, and that was something that's happened regular basis in my policing experience as well, where things are certainly a lot less frantic early in the morning than what they are generally during the evenings, into the late evenings, early mornings. The community's generally asleep, depending on what's obviously occurring in the community, but the community's generally calmer at that stage, so you've got a better possibility of effecting an arrest safely.
Now, over the next hours, you had a series of conversations with Acting Shane McCormack, is that correct?
Acting Sergeant Shane
I
McCormack.
apologise, Acting Sergeant. And where was he located physically?
Look, on that particular day, he was in the office next door to where mine was, in the ground floor at the police station.
And you had a conversation with him more or less as soon as you got off the phone with Superintendent Nobbs, is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct, yes. Yeah.
In fact, you walked into Acting Sergeant McCormack's office.
Correct. Yes, sir.
Could you remember specifically what was said then?
Specifically, no, I can't speculate on specifically. No.
What did you understand Acting Sergeant Shane McCormack's role to be in the deployment of the IRT?
Yeah, well, generally, I'd go to who was in charge of that area, and originally I wasn't sure, but I knew Mr. McCormack was, so Acting Sergeant McCormack was involved with the IRT, so that's my initial thing, is to work out, because I knew the regular Sergeant Lee Bowens was away. I'm sure I was on recreation leave at that particular point in time. So, in regard to the recall of any of the IRT members, I generally would go through the sergeant who's in charge of that area, and that's what the first question I posed to Acting Sergeant McCormack was who's in charge of the IRT presently, and he responded. I remember him responding to me saying, "Oh, yeah, I am."
So if, to go back to the language you used a little bit earlier, your input was effectively administrative. Was Sergeant McCormack, Acting Sergeant McCormack, making the operational to tactical decisions?
Yeah, well, that's to say, I put it towards him to organise people to come out. I was totally unaware of what their training is and who they'd put together. That was sort of thing. My only requirement on top of that was just to say that I didn't want to particularly choose people that had actually were coming on the next shift, because I mean, obviously the IRT is what you term as a part-time sort of area, or voluntary sort of situation where people were trained in certain areas and they could deploy at short notice.
You set out the sequence of these conversations between Superintendent Nobbs and Acting Sergeant McCormack in your recorded statement. I'm not going to ask you much, if anything, further about them.
Okay.
I do want to ask you a question about one of the phone calls you had, which is a telephone call you said you had with Superintendent Nobbs on speakerphone.
Yep, correct. That was with Acting Sergeant McCormack in the office as well.
Okay.
That was just basically to make sure that everyone was on the same page as such. So I'm not trying to transfer information through that could be misconstrued or wasn't exactly the intentions of what Superintendent Nobbs wanted.
Can you remember specifically what was said during that conversation while he was on speakerphone?
Specifically, no. I'd look up. I can't remember. I can't recall. Sorry, Your Honour.
Are you aware of whether there was any independent direct contact between Acting Sergeant Shane McCormack and Superintendent Nobbs in those hours between 1:30 and about 2:40?
I couldn't say that with any certainty at all. I mean, I was, I was obviously had a number of things happening, which generally is in that role, the watch commander's role, that do happen. And obviously later on that afternoon, there was a lot of things on my mind and a lot of things that I was doing.
My final question for you, or topic for you, concerns some of the emails that you've annexed to your recorded statement.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about, emails from Shane McCormack
Yes.
at around about 4:30 in the afternoon.
Yes.
What was your understanding of why you were receiving those emails?
Well, I was on the, obviously with Acting Sergeant McCormack, I'd spoken to him earlier, so he, obviously as a watch commander, he'd sent them through to me. He'd also sent them to the oncoming watch commander and a number of other people. I forwarded one on, there's, which I haven't really sort of gone into, there's another level above myself in the sort of operational sort of sense, which was at the time a territory duty officer, and that was at the time Superintendent Hager Burns, who I'd been conversing with in regard to the bus incident, and also this. So I forwarded any other emails to her as well, knowing that she would be in the office.
So, for example, you might not recall, but if I put it to you that in Annexure C of your recorded statement, there's an email forwarded from your email at 4:39 p.m. To Divisional Superintendent or Territory Duty Officer.
It was termed the Territory Duty Officer at that time. It's now called Territory Duty Superintendent, which is similar roles. Just
so that email forwarded at 4:39. The original email being an email at 4:24 p.m. from Acting Sergeant McCormack. That's the kind of thing you're talking about.
Yeah, that would be correct in that instance. I forwarded it through there.
Provide, apart from that administrative input, did you provide any input of a tactical or operational nature on any of these emails that were sent to you?
No, I'm almost certain that there was no other information on there. It was a matter of making sure everyone that needed to be aware of things were aware of things.
Thank you. No further questions.
No questions, Your Honour.
Any questions? Yes, Mr. Bolton.
Well, I'm counsel for Narjar. Okay. Just to clarify, when you were involved on this day concerning rostering members who happen to be members of the IRT, did you identify to Mr. McCormack the need to get members of the IRT, or did it just so happen that the people who were contacted were members of the IRT?
Okay, interesting. It was an IRT. From what I understand, they wanted the IRT thing, which falls under Acting Sergeant McCormack, I suppose, to contact the people. So at that stage, it wasn't anyone. It was targeted as obviously the members of the IRT. And if I had to use obviously the members that were coming on, I would then further phone calls to attempt to try and find other people to fill their spaces. So.
But Mr. McCormack was only going to contact IRT people, right?
That's what the at that stage that's what the call was made, and I'm sure that I'm not. I mean, again, I can't speculate anything, but I'm sure if they come short there, that there might have been other conversations in regard to whether it was going to happen or not.
But certainly, so far as your conversations with Mr. Nobbs go, you understood that he wanted IRT people.
That is correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Had you deployed the IRT before?
Myself personally,
You.
no, Your Honour, I hadn't.
How common was it to deploy IRT to communities outside of Alice Springs?
That's a question that I couldn't answer with any certainty, but certainly in my role that I'd been there, I hadn't, but I know deployments had been made, but certainly not from myself, from my role organising the initial call. Does that
No, I got it.
assist?
Yeah, it does. Was there a designated leader of the IRT as at the 9th of November when you made your calls?
That was probably raised in regard to no. There was. I went and spoke to Acting Sergeant McCormack and asked who was in charge of that.
So
of
there's
that
no
area.
record in the police station of how you go about engaging the IRT?
Well, generally, from my understanding, that if an IRT recall was required, then it would be the person that that was generally in charge of that area. That it would be the OIC of the station divisional superintendent would have oversight over that. But I mean, generally, it was known that Sergeant Bowens was the sergeant who organised the IRT.
That was a known truth as opposed to
As opposed to a
policy
sign.
or a protocol, is that right?
There was nothing specific written around the place to say that was the person to go to.
And certainly, given he was away, it wasn't exactly clear who you should go to.
It wasn't clear to me. No, Your Honour.
Lucky Mr McCormack was on duty then.
Well, if that wasn't the case, I would have looked into it a little bit further to see where I had to go. So I can't answer that with any more certainty. Sorry.
Now we all know that the IRT was deployed, or members of the IRT were deployed, and we know a lot now about what happened in Yuendamu over the next 48 hours. But to your knowledge, was there any debriefing of the IRT after this particular incident?
Not to my knowledge, no.
You might not know, given you've never deployed them before, but to your knowledge, was it normal to have a debriefing of the IRT members after a deployment?
Generally, if you're going into a situation and when you finish your operation and then you do a debriefing in regard to the IRT on a regular basis. I wasn't involved in enough, and I only sort of seen it from a distance as such, I suppose.
So, as a chain of command or line of command, were you in the line of command over the members of the IRT when they were deployed?
Just think of the situation. I mean, obviously the overall operations of the initial attendance at a major incident and initial things when it got to the deployment of the IRT, generally at a different. If it was a planned operation, generally the watch commander wouldn't be overly involved in it, apart from the operational oversight, I suppose, of anything.
Sounds like you're involved in the administrative arrangements, but not the oversight. Do you agree with that?
Certain circumstances, because it's like if they were deployed, they generally have their own the structure that they operate under. As a watch commander, you've got you're doing the overall operations of their area, not specifically on one particular incident, unless it had occurred and you were working it up and organising things. Generally, at that stage, you'd be sort of handing it over to the division.
So I just want to check.
So,
Are you talking about incidents that occurred in the Alice Springs patrol, or are you differentiating between Alice Springs on the one hand and, say, Yuendamu or another community in the Southern Desert region on the other? Or was there a difference?
At that particular time, because I mean, obviously, over time things shift and change a little bit in regard to structures, but initial attendance, initial dealing with an incident, wherever it would be, would generally come at that particular point in time, would come initially to the watch commander to look at if it was reported via there, if it was reported via our communications, via 000, just the initial attendance. Is that?
Yeah, but I'm talking about who's in control, who takes responsibility. Is it the watch commander's job to be responsible for the IRT in 2019?
No. Well, so that wasn't. Depending on deployments and aspects of what's occurring, but
What
there
about
would be.
patrol sergeant, shift supervisor? Is it their job to be in control of the IRT?
No.
So who's in control of the IRT?
They come under their own structure, under the officer in charge of the police station.
What about Superintendent Nobbs, who caused the deployment in one way or another? Was it his job to be in control of the IRT? You think?
Well, in an overall sense, that falls the divisional superintendent who requested that would be responsible. Yes, the deployment of the IRT was authorised by the superintendent and the plans, but the IRT has it from my understanding had a sergeant there.
Mr. Barnes.
Well, he was on leave at the time. Obviously.
Mr. McCormack.
Mr. McCormack.
Was a sergeant.
Correct.
He was never going to be involved in the actual operation, was he?
I can't. I mean, I went to him to organise staff, and that was sort of where. Well, after he's in charge of that in that team, as far as I would be aware.
Certainly, by the time you asked Mr. McCormack to do what he could to gather members for the task, you had basically fulfilled your role. Is that right?
At that stage, I mean, I'm a finite resource as well, and I've had obviously something that was a critical incident that was happening at the time. Certainly, maintain my focus for the rest of my shift. There was another. The evening shift watch commander, they actually commenced duty at 3 p.m. So there was, at that stage, I was dealing with that other incident. But does that sort of assist?
Certainly.
Okay, thanks.
We've got your evidence quite clear in that regard. Just one other thing. When Mr. Nobbs spoke to you and told you why he was after assistance, you were told that there'd been a health staff pullout, there was issues with crime in the community, and that a particular individual who you've now identified as Kumanjayi was considered to be someone who might be involved in that. Were you also not told that there was a need to arrest him at some stage?
Yeah, I think is that in what I've gone through already? I think.
In your statement you did,
yeah.
you said that you took the understanding that the trigger for organising the response was an attempt to arrest this chap, Kumanjayi. That's as Dave said.
I mean, it's general policing assistance with to the members out there. Yes, correct. That's right.
That's all I was to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Honour. I just have a few questions, Senior Sergeant. I act for the Walker Lane and Robertson families. I just have some questions in relation to some matters that you raised in your statement. I believe it's about page 56 where you were asked some questions about the deployment of the IRT. And one of the matters you raised was that on the Saturday it was that the funeral was for a member of the Walker family. So there was information that Superintendent Nobbs maybe provided to you about a funeral.
So there was a funeral in community that
Yes.
was also there. Again, for me to regurgitate all that, I'm unfortunately sorry, my memory's not that good. My statement's probably the best of knowledge at the moment, because I know over time So, Your Honour, that over time there's been so much information that sometimes, my memories of certain things aren't as clear on that as they possibly should be.
Okay, so it's more that you remember that there was a funeral, but not necessarily the particulars that it was the Walker family funeral. Is that what your memory was?
There was a funeral in the community at the time. Yeah, no, I certainly know that, and obviously for that the Walker, obviously the Walker family were involved with that.
And knowing that it was Kumanjayi's family's funeral. Had you made that connection when that information was given to you?
Question, but I wouldn't have. I would have said it would have been a family member, but depending on extended family, I'm not sure who. I still wouldn't know who the funeral was for as such. But obviously a community member that was related to Kumanjayi.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. Well, really, the only question I have then is: did Superintendent Nobbs provide you any details about the plan to arrest Kumanjayi after this funeral?
That was over the telephone. Are you talking that when he spoke to me over the telephone? There was. I do recall because it sits in my mind as something that I would have considered was the early morning arrest. I think, as I've told Your Honour before, recently that the early morning arrest is probably the over time has proven to be the safest way to arrest a person is early in the morning when the community is generally quiet.
So is that, did Superintendent Nobbs specifically say to you it's going to be after the funeral, or did you just make the connections that the funeral is on the Saturday and the plan was to arrest on the Sunday?
No, I'm sure that the early morning was raised with me at the time. Because I was comfortable in the fact that it was going to occur, anything was going to occur the next day as opposed to during that evening.
Okay. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Any other questions?
No questions, thank you, Your Honour.
Got one question replying now. Your last answer was you were comfortable in the fact that the arrest was going to occur the next morning.
The next morning. Comfortable in the fact that it's in my knowledge that it was planned for early the next morning. I'm comfortable in the knowledge that
you feel relatively certain of your memory.
Of my memory on that aspect of it, because I felt comfortable that it was going to occur the next morning. It was to get the people out there to get them up to speed to go to the next morning, as opposed to they're going out there now and gonna do things. That was sort of where, I'm comfortable in my recollection of that particular point.
Okay, I think it's clarified.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Nothing else, Your Honour.
Again, Senior Sergeant, thank you for making yourself available at short notice and coming in from your evidence today. That's appreciated.
That's fine, Your Honour. Thank you very much.
I think that completes our evidence for today, and we will adjourn till 9:30 tomorrow.
All stand, the Coronial Court now stands adjourned.
Yes.